Yeah, I always wonder how much of this is, because I was thinking about like causes of things historically, and I do wonder how much of it is certain branches of Protestantism. And this is coming from a Reformed background myself. I was part of a very kind of strict Reformed tradition where there was no imagery in a church service, right? That was kind of a distraction because you were there to worship and contemplate God, and almost the theology, the ideas about God were the most important part of being in a service. So you even take the Lord's Supper together, and you come to the church, and the pastor gives a 10-minute theological explanation of the Lord's Supper, which seems like that's kind of the more important thing than actually
taking it.
The supper itself is the idea behind it. And this was one of the things that kind of drove me away from the Reformed tradition was a contemplation of the sacred, and just the notion that there's this divorce between the embodiment of the self in the church service. So it's almost like you're kind of a bunch of these disconnected minds all here in church to hear a theological message and think about it. And if anything, your body or your senses are a distraction, because you could be distracted by the stained glass windows. So you want to cover those up. Or you could be distracted if the pastor were to wear a robe of any kind. So you don't have that. And there's even a kind of fear that the songs would be too pretty. So you don't want that. And I do wonder how much of that just historically did lead to what you find with this notion of the art being separated or beauty being separated from just the things of ordinary life. Because
it really is, in the end, it really is, in my estimation, a lack of incarnational thinking in general.
Right.
And I think that there's a kind of unconsciousness, which I don't think, like I said, I don't think it's on purpose. It's interesting because, for example, Calvin, in his refutation of icons and of sacred art, right, completely ignores St. John of Damascene's incarnational argument. And I think maybe he didn't even know it. It's possible that he didn't have access to that argument. So he acts as if it doesn't exist. And it's interesting because that's really the key to a lot of the modern problems in terms of the difference between this kind of disembodied mind that is just there in church to receive information, right, and think about it, rather than this embodied participation. So ultimately what you'll have is, it's inevitable. I remember I grew up in a Baptist church, and I mean, the people there were wonderful, like wonderful Christians. But I remember I would ask them, like, why don't we kneel in church? And they would say, well, because that's just an exterior like action. So, but we could kneel, but we could also not kneel. And so we don't, right? That's what ends up happening.
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
So in the end, we don't, and so there's the sense in which, instead of understanding, I think, in a proper Christian manner, even like in a biblical way, that like works are informed by your faith. That is, works are the embodiment of your faith. Even though if I told a Christian at that time that's the right way of thinking, they said, of course that is. But then there's something that happens because there's such a opposition of faith and works that ultimately all works, all exterior manifestations are almost seen as suspect at the outset, are seen as possibly idolatrous, and possibly, let's say, as a form of hypocrisy. Any form of outward gestures could be hypocritical.
Yeah, for sure, because there's a denial of anything bodily or external, and there's this pitting of authenticity against anything that's bodily, that's inauthentic, right? And I think that's you see that with Heidegger, for example, and I think this has and it goes prior to Heidegger as well with the Romantics, but it's this notion essentially that to do things as expected ritually is necessarily a negative thing. It's kind of it's in opposition to the inner self. So you have this outer versus inner self, that any outer actions that you perform are they're always at least a little bit suspect, right? Mm-hmm. And you find this going back even further to the Great Awakening in the United States. And with the Great Awakening, you have someone like George Whitefield, who makes the assumption when he starts meeting pastors that these pastors probably aren't really saved, because they probably haven't had the real internal experience. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's very much part of the American religious experience, the American religious phenomenon.
But it's interesting because now we can destroy that. I mean, so let's say one of my one of the structures I use to help people destroy that is to show how ritualized your every
Absolutely.
gesture is. That is,
Yeah.
I tell people, okay, try it. Like when you speak to someone, try to break the ritual. Like do something else. Lie down on the ground. Start talking to the back of their head. Like do all these things that are not expected of you, and see what happens. Like you will see communion break down. You'll see the whole of society break down. And you realize that everything we do, from opening doors to driving cars, that are all these kind of ritualized liturgical behaviors. Right. And there is a manner in which we can be hypocritical. And I think Christ is constantly attacking hypocrisy, because there's something about the human person which can, let's say, disconnect the inner and the outer.
Yes.
And it's part of the fall. But that's the problem. The real, what we're trying to aim for is to connect them together so that so that one reflects the other, and we have a true kind of embodied incarnational behavior.
Yeah, there is no real internal authentic self that's divorced from how we react externally to things around us. We just can't live that way. It's an impossibility. And I think, I heard this all the time, within evangelicalism. People always go to the prophets, and the prophets who are often criticizing the hypocrisy, just as you're saying, where God says things like he doesn't desire their sacrifices. And
you have to keep reading that. You have to keep reading that chapter, right? At the end, it says, and then we will sacrifice.
Exactly.
Once we fix the inner part, then the outer part will become a reflection of
exactly. The goal is the alignment of the inner and outer self. Not to say the external things are bad and the internal things are good. That's how we've unfortunately, I think, misunderstood things.